President Trump has made his first public speech since the election, speaking at a rally in Georgia in support of two Republicans seeking re-election to the U.S. Senate. Earlier, he had failed in efforts to get the local governor to convene a special session of the state legislature aimed at overturning the presidential result. He told a crowd in Valdosta that he had in fact won in Georgia, giving no evidence. There have again been violent clashes in Paris between riot police and demonstrators over a proposed new security law. Protesters attacked shops, ripped up pavements and burned cars. The consortium building the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, led by the Russian energy giant Gazprom, has said work is to resume in the project, despite continued opposition from the US and several European countries. The pipeline will boost Russian natural gas shipments to Europe. Lufthansa, Europe's largest airline, has warned that tens of thousands of additional jobs are under threat as it scales down its operations. Lufthansa said the pandemic made it harder than ever to predict how quickly any recovery might come. 19 people have been arrested by Italian police, accused of running a smuggling ring bringing migrants to Europe. It's alleged they transported people to Italy and then on to Northern Europe. English football fans have returned to stadiums to cheer on Premier League teams for the first time in 9 months. But social distancing meant numbers were limited to a couple of thousand fans per match. BBC News.
That is cathedral-like. It's got these beautiful arches with 3 different colours of brickwork and these rows on rows of arched windows. It's a palace of filth, is what it is.
Yeah, the Victorians were obviously pretty serious about their sewage.
Welcome to Crowd Science, the science show that's led by your curiosity. I'm Marnie Chesterton, and I'm out with my producer Kathy in a part of London that really doesn't feature on most tourist routes. We're in the east, marvelling at Abbey Mills pumping station, built in the 19th century by engineer Joseph Bazalgette to shunt the city's waste down to the River Thames. And that's where we're heading to.
We're going to follow this path, and this is the path of the sewer that leads the poo of North London to the Thames.
Luckily for us, these days it's a pleasant cycle path, albeit with the occasional whiff of drains. But the reason we're following this sewer, designed by a 19th century civil engineer, is because of a question from a 21st century civil engineer, Crowd Science listener Mark in Malta.
My question for Crowd Science is, are humans naturally clean and tidy, or is it something that we develop through nurture rather than nature?
I'm wondering, do you have a gut instinct on what the answer is for this?
Well, if we look through the history of humankind, humans have usually set up their villages near and around waterways for agricultural purposes, for drinking purposes, transport, but it was also a means of discarding their effluent. So basically they used to put their excrement in the same place where they used to source their water from. If we had to look at other animals, they're naturally and instinctively clean. If you look at cats, for example, they scat in a hole, which they dig themselves and then bury it. I think humans don't really have an inherent instinct to get rid of it in a way that is sanitary.
Do we really lack the instinct to be clean? Being a civil engineer, Mark knows all about the sophisticated technology we've invented to deal with our waste, like, for example, the sewer we're following down to the River Thames in London.
I guess this is actually on top of the sewer, and it does smell.
Oh, yes. Yeah, now I can smell that.
Before this was built, waste disposal was much more haphazard around here. And even now, with a host of engineering solutions, the planet is littered with our discarded waste more than ever. But does that mean we're uniquely filthy as a species? To find out how we measure up to other animals, I turn to a zoologist.
I'm Adam Hart. I'm Professor of Science Communication at the University of Gloucestershire, and among other things, I study what leaf-cutting ants do with the waste that they produce.
Excellent. Our listener Mark is wondering if humans are naturally clean and tidy, and it seems to him that there are other animals that have better instincts for this than us. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Yes, I think there is. And I think the problem comes here that if we're not that clean and tidy most of the time, we don't have particularly harsh penalties. But if you look across the animal kingdom, you find quite a lot of animals that if they're not clean and tidy and really scrupulously hygienic about what they do, the penalties are really quite severe. And we see that, for example, in some of the ants that I've studied.
Maybe the gold standard for scrupulous hygiene is found amongst leafcutter ants, which live in the tropical forests of Central and South America.
So leaf-cutting ants have a really unusual biology. They hollow out sort of almost head-sized chambers in the ground, and in those chambers they farm a fungus, and they use that fungus to feed their larvae, and they're really 100% reliant on it. But for that fungus to grow, they have to have the perfect conditions for fungi to grow, so they have to weed their garden, if you like. What you find in a lot of ants is that they will have middens, we call them, sort of garbage heaps, basically, and they gather up all of the things that they don't want in their fungus garden, and they'll have a whole string of different types of workers that are transferring that waste and making that flow out of the nest very much one way. They like to climb up trees and drop it, so they don't even have to sort of walk on this big waste heap they've made. And the ants that are on the waste heap, kind of processing the waste and making sure it disappears as rapidly as possible, they'll pretty much die on the waste. They don't go back into the clean areas once they're covered in all this rubbish.
Wait, so if you're a designated garbage disposal ant, once you've got dirty, you keep yourself separate from the nice clean bits?
That very much seems to be the case. If you're working that waste outside, you definitely don't want to be going back into the colony. So once you're into the sort of career pathway, if you like, of bringing waste out and dumping it and working it, you're never going to find yourself doing any of the more glamorous jobs inside the colony or bringing the leaves in. You're a waste disposal ant and a very crucial part of the colony. And somewhere between 12 and 15% of the ants that work outside, they are working the waste. That's how important it is to these colonies.
Ants are a shining example of clean behaviour because their biology demands it. Although we humans can cause ourselves serious problems with the way we deal with waste, being a bit lax with hygiene doesn't usually kill us. Evolution hasn't forced us to be as clean as ants. But what about other animals? I can't be alone in wondering about the different strategies animals have for going to the loo, right? I mean, listener Mark mentioned cats burying their poo, but cows and sheep just seem to go wherever they're standing. What's going on there?
Some animals you'll be watching and it's just pouring out the back end and they don't seem to care. Other animals will go to quite great lengths to go to a specific area. Some antelope, for example, will go to a sort of latrine area. It's really linked to their ecology, so quite often animals are using dung and also urine as marking posts and territorial markers to say to other groups of animals and other individuals that, well, this is my territory, not yours. But equally, some animals like to bury their waste. If you think about it, some animals like to announce their presence and others like to keep their presence a little bit more cryptic, and those strategies often mix into how they go into the toilet.
Have you noticed a common strategy for not defecating or peeing near open bodies of water amongst other animals?
No, and in fact with leaf-cutting ants, what you'll find is that they will go out of their way to dump in water if they can, because it gets rid of the waste quickly, particularly if it's flowing water.
See, I think that's quite sensible as well, because it just takes it away for you. But I was wondering if that was a curiously human strategy that when you start building up cities is clearly a terrible strategy.
Yes, I mean, obviously if you're polluting your own water source, that's a big problem. But an ant colony, which might have 8 million individuals in it, doesn't rely on a nearby water source. So actually polluting in that sense their local water course isn't a big deal. The other interesting thing with the waste that they produce is that it's quite nitrogen near tropical forests. So quite differently from us, we generally think of our waste as a bad thing, and we probably should. And in general, we're polluting and despoiling the environment with our waste. But actually with ants, they seem to be enhancing it because of their nutrient cycling. And that definitely feels like something that we could learn from them.
So not only are ants very careful with their waste, it also forms part of a balanced ecosystem. Human waste, at least in recent times, tends to cause more problems. That's illustrated by the history of the place Kathy and I have now cycled to.
I think at the end here, this is where the river is.
We've followed the sewer to its end, a place called Barking Creek, on the eastern edge of London.
That's a man that might be Mark. Hello!
Hello to you.
Hi, I'm
To find out more about the history of this place, we meet up with Mark Watson, the education officer at Vallance House, the local museum.
Mark, we just cycled down alongside the Northern Outfall sewer. Is that where it comes out? Is that what we're looking at?
Yes, you're looking at across the lower part of the River Roding and into the Thames. That's where the Northern Outfall sewer used to discharge in the Victorian period.
I asked Mark how this sewer came to be built.
Before Victorian times, when London was much smaller than it is today, your waste tended to be disposed of where you could get rid of it. So it went in sewers and it got discharged into smaller rivers, and the smaller rivers flowed into the Thames and then was discharged out to sea. Because the River Thames was a tidal river, so it kept itself reasonably clean. But as the population grew, then the smaller rivers and the sewers ended up compacted, the sewage overflowed, and then you ended up with the Great Stink in London in the 1850s, where even Parliament noticed the smell from the river was so disgusting.
And did they call it the Great Stink at the time?
They did call it the Great Stink, yes. And of course, if Parliament notices it, something is done.
In the 19th century, there was a population explosion in London, and the city got increasingly filthy. There were regular cholera and typhoid outbreaks. This was certainly not a proud moment for human cleanliness. Victorian engineers came to the rescue, but they didn't solve the problem entirely.
After the Great Stink, they constructed an enormous sewage system around London. And at the end of the Northern Outfall sewer, there was the Beckton Sewage Works, and from there it was discharged into the River Thames.
Right where we can see?
Right where we can see here, between those two piers, that's where it'd all be squirted out. It was supposed to be squirted out when the river was turning, and that meant that it would all be carried out to sea. But it doesn't necessarily always seem to have happened that way. And sometimes if the tide turned, it would start being pushed back towards London or up the River Roding past where we're standing and into central Barking.
So this place probably became a load stinkier.
Apparently, the banks just where we're standing used to glisten. And they glisten with the sludge of human sewage. There was also some people that made a living skimming off from the surface of the river with a sieve fat, which they were packing in casks and selling it to the local factories. It was called Thames mud butter, and that was used for lubrication of the machinery, but it's in fact just fat from untreated human waste.
Mark, that's possibly the most disgusting thing I've heard this week.
But it's one of the nicest fun facts you're going to hear today.
Mud butter.
Thames mud butter.
Revolting as that is, I suppose you could spin it as a positive recycling story. But the river was still a serious health hazard. And when a paddle steamer boat crashed here after the sewers were finished, hundreds of passengers died because of the toxic water they were pitched into. The biggest inland water disaster in UK history. Nowadays, the sewage treatment plant here has cleaned things up a lot. Globally, though, water pollution is still a huge problem. The UN calculates that over 80% of wastewater is released into the environment without adequate treatment. But the fact we pollute our water sources doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have clean instincts. Maybe those instincts just haven't kept pace with our capacity to generate vast quantities of waste. We heard how London's sewage problems got much worse when the population boomed in the 19th century. But what if we go much, much further back? 8,000 years, for example. Maybe we were better back then.
I'm Dr. Lisa Marie Shillito. I'm a senior lecturer in landscape archaeology at Newcastle University. I look at the relationship between people and their environment very broadly in the past.
We're trying to find out whether humans are naturally clean. And one of the things you do is study ancient poo. So I think that might help us out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of got into this, not on purpose, I should say. It was quite a kind of accidental thing. I didn't set out to become like an ancient poo expert. But I was working at this site called Çatalhöyük in Turkey, which is a large early agricultural settlement site. And I was working on the midden deposits, what we would call, I guess, a rubbish heap. So these middens at Çatalhöyük, it turned out, had a lot of coprolites in them. So coprolite is the word that we use to describe fossilized feces in archaeology. We like our technical terms. They're a little bit more polite, I guess, than talking about ancient poo.
And presumably where you find ancient poo gives you a clue to what people in the past were doing with their waste?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can actually look at the coprolites themselves to tell us about diet and things like that. But indeed, where we actually find them on an archaeological site can tell us a lot about what people were doing with that waste. And it's Çatalhöyük's very interesting, actually, because we have these neighbourhood clusters of buildings, and then adjacent to those building clusters, that's where we find the midden deposits. But we see quite clear distinctions between the areas where people were living, so within the buildings, which are actually kept very, very clean, and these large midden deposits. Even at the microscopic scale, when you look at the floor layers within the buildings, they're actually incredibly clean. People were very regularly sweeping out the buildings, and in fact, we have evidence that they were frequently replastered. Quite a lot of home maintenance, basically, kind of keeping them very fresh looking.
That's fantastic that you can go back 8,000 years and see how clean someone's floor was.
It's absolutely fascinating. Looking down the microscope and you realise I'm looking at this floor plastering layer from the Neolithic period.
Encouraging evidence of early humans' capacity for cleanliness, then. But in Çatalhöyük, the waste heaps are right next door to the buildings, and it looks like that may have led to health problems.
In some of the coprolites that we've looked at from these middens, we found evidence of parasite infection, so whipworm eggs, for example. So yeah, we do have some evidence that obviously, as we probably expect, that living in close quarters in relatively dense settlements with lots of other people inevitably leads to the kind of transmission of these sorts of diseases.
And from your work looking at human societies throughout the ages, would you say that humans are naturally clean or more prone to polluting our surroundings?
My feeling is that I don't think humans are any more prone to being kind of dirty than many other animals. We have quite a lot of similarities actually in terms of this is where we live, this is where we keep our waste. And I think the problems that we see with pollution is more from when we get very large numbers of people and we find it harder to kind of keep that waste compartmentalised, I guess, and it starts kind of creeping into waterways and things like that.
This is Crowd Science from the BBC World Service, where this week we're digging into the subject of waste to answer our listener Mark's question about whether humans are naturally clean. We've just heard from archaeologist Lisa Marie Shillito. And looking back into early human history, it seems like we do have an inherent tendency to keep our waste away from us. That might mean dumping it onto a waste heap or dropping it into a river, like the Thames, where I am now, and hoping that the river will flush it far away. As we've heard, that's not always a great strategy, since it can lead to the spread of diseases like whipworm, cholera or typhoid. But nonetheless, what's driving that basic motivation to get our waste away from us?
Humans, like other species, have had a problem of infectious disease. It's current at the moment, but it's existed for millions of years. And infectious diseases are, what we call a selection pressure, an evolutionary force that's shaping, obviously, our immune systems, but also potentially our brains, our cognition, and our behaviour.
Dr. Michal de Barra is a psychology lecturer at Brunel University in the UK. He studies human behaviour and health from an evolutionary perspective.
So in humans, it seems like the emotion disgust is a big part of how we deal with infectious disease problems. It's characterised by avoidance, by sometimes kind of feelings of nausea. And what's interesting about it is that it is elicited by many of the things that are infectious disease threats in our environment. So that might be particular smells or particular substances, body wastes, physical signs of infectious disease, coughs, sneezes. Yeah, exactly. So this has led various psychologists to think that maybe this is a psychological arm of the immune system that's functioning to push us away from things that might cause infectious disease.
I think of the immune system as something that's very much chemistry and biology, molecules in our bloodstream. But it's interesting to hear of disgust being co-opted for the same cause.
Mounting an immune response is really physiologically costly, and it's potentially unsuccessful. So much better is just to avoid getting infected in the first place. And you see that disgust does quite a good job of keeping us away from things that might cause infection. And it also has some other kind of features that make it an intuitive microbiologist. So if you imagine something disgusting touching off some other object, even if that object was previously neutral, most people have this kind of new revulsion to that object that briefly touched the disgusting thing. And that, if you think about it, mirrors quite closely how viruses and bacteria spread in the environment.
It's funny, people seem to have different tolerances for how clean their surroundings need to be. So I'm just wondering, it's not this uniform reflex, is it learned?
There is quite a lot of debate in the literature about what kind of role learning plays in disgust. And some people have argued that this is a very strong genetic basis. And you would expect, based on that idea, to have very, very similar disgust responses across cultures and across time. Other people argue for a stronger role for learning, for what we call a cultural evolution. And that way you can have a spread of kind of hygienic rules. So a lot of religious rituals, for example, in Islam, there's clear rules about washing your hands before you eat and after using the bathroom and so on. A lot of religions make use of ideas about purity and contamination. And these are intuitively they make sense to us, right? And perhaps because of this long interaction with infectious disease, these ideas kind of resonate with people.
So if we're answering Mark's question about being clean and tidy, whether that's natural, can I ask what you think?
Well, it depends what we mean by natural here. As a psychologist, I tend to think about a lot of things as natural, and our capacity to learn is natural. So in that sense, yes, it certainly is a natural behavior pattern.
So our behaviour is also part of our immune system, the psychological branch. Think of that instinctive feeling of being disgusted by filth. You can see how that makes sense. But Michal is saying it's more than that the psychology of obeying social norms is also a natural and a crucial part of keeping clean.
So this norm psychology, this tendency to learn what other people do the same, and perhaps feel a little bit upset by people who violate these rules. That kind of norm psychology seems to be really important in sustaining hygiene behavior. So if things get locked in as social norms, then they kind of depend less on people's just individual cost-benefit judgment of is it worth it, because you're suddenly concerned about what other people think of you.
So wanting to keep up with everyone else, to follow cultural norms, is a really strong incentive for people to keep clean and tidy. And public health initiatives can tap into that motivation to try and improve hygiene and sanitation.
So my name's Janala Chipungo. I work for an institution called the Center for Infectious Disease Research in Zambia, and I'm a social behavioral scientist there.
Universal access to clean water and sanitation is one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but we're not there yet. There's an urgent need to improve sanitation in many parts of Zambia, where outbreaks of cholera and child deaths from diarrhea are not uncommon. There are loads of problems preventing good sanitation. Poverty, lack of piped water, the cost of soap. Despite these barriers, experts like Janala are trying to use what we know about human behaviour to improve hygiene and health.
The barriers are many. You don't have a tap just there to open. The infrastructure that can allow somebody to easily practice hygiene behaviors like hand washing, like toilet cleaning, become harder. We've also noticed that the social norms around hygiene behaviors are weak. And whether this comes from the fact that it's been so hard to practice, that it's not really just normal for somebody to walk out the toilet and go straight to wash their hands, because people just understand that it's a very difficult behavior to practice. And so the social norms around hand hygiene practices, but also toilet cleaning, are not that strong.
Janala and her colleagues wanted to see if an approach called behaviour-centred design could help.
So behaviour-centred design really looks at behaviour very holistically. It has a list of 15 motives that are universal to all humans. 5 of these, for example, would be discussed, as you mentioned. It has lust, comfort, affiliation, and status. But what we do when we go into the field is try and identify what most appeals to you as an individual or as a household or as a community. So if we're saying toilet cleaning or hand washing, we would say, what would make you wash your hands with soap after using the toilet? Would it be fear? Would it be that you want to look attractive? Would it be that you want to affiliate with your community?
One of the places Janala works is Bauleni, a neighbourhood on the outskirts of Zambia's capital, Lusaka.
Bauleni is a community within Lusaka district. It has about 70,000 people. It's very crowded. The plots that are there are unplanned, and you have an average of 15 people on the plot. Mostly, these plots only have one toilet, which are just basic pit latrines, but in very poor quality.
To improve that quality, researchers worked with the community to identify 4 things that would make the toilets better. Things like putting locks on the door and drawing up a cleaning rota. But how do you turn a wish list into reality? As part of the project, Janala's team made some brilliant videos, small stories of toilet traumas played out by actors. It's a woman who's come out of the toilet and she's berating this guy who's just trying to read the paper and ignoring her. And she's saying, I'm tired of cleaning the toilet. It's always me that cleans the toilet.
Yes, so that video was really inspired from the stories that we got. There were quite a number of accounts where tenants and landlords were not very happy with one another about the state of the toilet.
These were then played to landlords, who are the ones mainly responsible for the communal toilets. And the crucial question, did this help improve the condition of the toilets?
We played them to just over 500 landlords. It sparked so much conversation around the problems that they faced. But what's even more important is that we saw an increase in the behaviors that we're promoting. There was a difference of 10% in terms of those that had a cleaning rota. And it may sound very small, but when it comes to behavior change, I think we really wear our proud hats because it's not something easy to change.
While they saw a definite improvement after the intervention, they don't know if this was a lasting effect. And Janala is realistic about the problems that remain.
Honestly, Mani, I think it's difficult. If we had piped water, basic piped water to the plot, would make these things so much easier. So while we are trying to improve people's behaviors, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that we also need investments within the infrastructure to make it easier. Or you do recognize that it's easier for you because you walk out of your room and there's a toilet and there's a sink and a tap and soap right there. But with others, it's not there. And you feel we need to do more.
The UN estimates over 4 billion people around the world lack access to adequate sanitation, so there's a huge amount of work still to be done. To come back to Mark's question about whether humans are naturally clean, well, from what we've heard in this show, it seems like we do have an instinctive drive to be clean, but that's something that's shaped by our society and resources. And when we crowd together in cities, keeping clean requires a whole load of technology and money. If you're interested in hearing more, Crowd Science's back catalogue has episodes about recycling, soap and hygiene, as well as a whole host of completely different subjects. Do check them out wherever you get your podcasts. Next time, Anand Jagatir will be here looking at interstellar flight. But for now, here's listener Mark to end the show.
That's all for this episode of Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. Today's question was from me, Mark in Malta. If you have a question for the team, please send it to crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Bye.
This is the BBC World Service, and on the Inquiry this week...
Fighting in Ethiopia's Tigray region has been raging for weeks. Troops were sent there by the Prime Minister, whose past mediation skills won a top award. I'm Charmaine Cozier. We're asking, why is Ethiopia's Nobel Peace Prize winner bombing his own country?
The Inquiry at bbcworldservice.com/inquiry. And in an hour, World Book Club with Harriet Gilbert.
A sensational debut novel included by the BBC in its list of the top 100 novels to shape our world. The book is called Homegoing, and here with us to answer questions about it from readers around the globe is its Ghanaian-American author, Ya Jassy.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
It's 2:00 GMT. I'm Jackie Leonard. This is the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Donald Trump's in Georgia. He's been speaking at his first rally since his election defeat in support of 2 Republican senators facing runoff votes next month.
There's never been a time like this. There's never been a case where a state has had this prominence on Senate races.
British and European negotiators are to resume talks on Sunday on a post-Brexit trade deal. Despite significant differences, time is of the essence.
This was always going to go down to the wire, the 11th hour, 1 minute to midnight, describe it how you like. It is now 1 minute to midnight, though.
Police in Italy have arrested 19 people accused of smuggling migrants into Europe. And the Russian-led consortium building the contentious Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline says work on it is restarting after a year's suspension. Those stories here on the newsroom from the BBC.
This is the BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. President Trump has made his first post-election stump speech at a rally in Georgia in support of two Republicans seeking re-election to the US Senate. The president told a large crowd that he had in fact won in Georgia, although official results gave the victory there to Joe Biden. But though he again alleged vote rigging in the November presidential race, he did urge Republicans to vote in next month's two crucial Senate runoff elections. Peter Bowes is our North America correspondent.
This is typical Donald Trump. He is in the kind of arena that he enjoys the most, and that is close with his most ardent of supporters. The tenor of the message is that he is fighting on and that he is going to continue with these baseless claims that there was fraud during this election. And he says, and referring to the election that's coming up, which really is what this rally is all about, the two Senate seats in Georgia. The election is in January. Actually, early voting starts in less than 2 weeks. He said that the Democrats are going to cheat again. And I think that's the kind of allegation that a lot of people have been looking out for, and especially local Republicans, perhaps nervous that it will actually put off some of their supporters from going to the polls.
Last-ditch negotiations between the European Union and Britain are due to resume on Sunday, despite the failure of a lengthy phone call between the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to break the deadlock. Mrs von der Leyen underlined the seriousness of the situation.
Both sides underline that no agreement is feasible if these issues are not solved. And whilst recognizing the seriousness of these differences, we agreed that a further effort should be undertaken by our negotiating teams to assess whether these issues can be resolved.
The consortium building the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, led by the Russian energy giant Gazprom, has said work is due to resume on the project, despite continued opposition from the United States and several European countries. Brenda Marshall has this report.
The pipeline under the Baltic Sea will boost natural gas shipments from Russia to Europe, bypassing Ukraine. Washington believes the project will compromise European energy security and enable Moscow to exert divisive political pressure on the continent. The United States has urged the European Union to halt the construction, but it has not responded. Poland and the Baltic states have voiced their opposition to the pipeline, while Germany has been criticised for supporting the project. The consortium includes German, Anglo-Dutch, French and Austrian companies.
Brenda Marshall. You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. Police in Italy have arrested 19 people accused of running a smuggling ring bringing migrants to Europe. It's alleged they transported people from countries including Afghanistan, Iraq and Pakistan to Italy and then on to Northern Europe. The police say those held include Italians, Iraqi Kurds and Afghans. Europe's largest airline, Lufthansa, has warned that tens of thousands of additional jobs are under threat as it scales down its flying schedule and fleet numbers to levels not seen since the 1970s. 30,000 staff lost their jobs in 2020, despite a German government bailout worth $11 billion. In a letter to employees, Lufthansa said the ongoing pandemic made it harder than ever to predict how quickly any recovery might come. A Japanese space capsule has parachuted to Earth carrying the first samples of rock from an asteroid. It looked like a shooting star as it re-entered the atmosphere, touching down in southern Australia at the end of its 6-year voyage. It had detached from the Hayabusa 2 spacecraft on Saturday. Australia's official astronomer at large, Fred Watson, says the material on board could unravel many mysteries.
For the first time, the Hayabusa 2 mission has extracted a soil sample from within the asteroid, and that could contain all kinds of secrets, including the mineral content might well tell us about the early history of the solar system, but the carbon content, that's the extraordinary part, the carbon-rich molecules may hold some clues as to the building blocks of life on Earth.
Football star fans have returned to stadiums to cheer on their English Premier League teams for the first time in 9 months. Social distancing restrictions meant that numbers were limited to a couple of thousand fans per game. The championship match between Millwall and Derby County started controversially, however. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Jackie Leonard and you're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Donald Trump has been speaking at his first campaign event since losing the presidential election to Joe Biden last month. But anyone listening to him at the rally in the state of Georgia wouldn't have guessed that was the result, as he again insisted, without any evidence, that there had been fraud and he was the real winner. He was there to boost 2 Republican senators, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, who face runoff elections next month.
There's never been a time like this. There's never been a case where a state has had this prominence on Senate races. The voters of Georgia will determine which party runs every committee, writes every piece of legislation, controls every single taxpayer dollar. Very simply, you will decide whether your children will grow up in a socialist country or whether they will grow up in a free country.
Our correspondent Peter Bowes was listening to Mr. Trump and joins us now. So, Peter, he was still insisting that there were voter irregularities, despite all the evidence to the contrary. But he was also talking about what he would have done, suggesting that he does know he's on his way out. What did you make of that?
Yes, his tone varied, didn't it, during this speech, starting off saying that he said, just so we understand, we won Georgia, which he didn't. He referred to winning Wisconsin, which he didn't. And talking in the same kind of way that we often heard him talk at the rallies in the weeks before the election, in many senses relitigating the election. But then he didn't sound quite so confident. He was talking about the number of federal judges that during his term in office that he's appointed over 300, and he said if we do a second term, which I hope we do, we'll do over 540 judges. So less certainty there that he is going to be the president for the next few years. And of course, we know that he won't be because he lost to Joe Biden. And around the country, those results have been certified. And the president continued with his theme that there were fraudulent votes cast, and talking about this special election coming up in January for the senators in Georgia, he again claimed that the Democrats will be cheating and that there would be fraudulent voting.
And he is reported to have called the governor of Georgia, isn't he, to push for Joe Biden's win to be overturned?
Yes, he wants essentially for the signatures on ballots to be rechecked. Now, the process goes like this, that people that send in mail-in ballots or postal ballots, they have a couple of envelopes. The actual vote is in the smaller internal envelope. The external envelope has the person's name on it and their signature, which can be verified against the official signature that the state has on record for that person. If you're an American, you might have a driving license with your official signature on. And those signatures are checked initially when the votes come in, but then they're separated so that it's not possible to tell down the road who an individual has voted for. So your signature isn't attached to the actual vote. So it's not possible to wind the clock back, if you like, to that point where the signatures come in with the initial ballots.
Peter, thank you. That was Peter Bowes. There's almost no time left, but Brexit talks get going again in Brussels later on Sunday after negotiators called a halt on Friday. An hour-long phone call on Saturday between the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen failed to break the deadlock. They warned that agreement wouldn't be possible unless major differences between the two sides were resolved. In a joint statement afterwards, Ms von der Leyen said that they were still divided on 3 critical issues: fishing rights, competition rules, and how any deal is enforced.
Both sides underline that no agreement is feasible if these issues are not solved. And whilst recognizing the seriousness of these differences, we agreed that a further effort should be undertaken by our negotiating teams to assess whether these issues can be resolved.
Fishing comprises a fraction of 1% of the British economy, but its symbolic importance is much greater, as our political correspondent Chris Mason explained.
Fish are important because the UK holds a pretty good hand as far as fishing is concerned. A big part of Brexit is taking back control. The UK wants to take greater control of its access to its own waters, but British waters matter, and matter particularly to the French. So France's Europe minister tells a French Sunday newspaper that they want large and lasting access to British waters. He goes on to say, we know that the days of full access are over, but they still want significant access. The UK is willing to grant access, but at the moment seemingly not as large and as lasting as the French would like. So fish matter.
There's lots of people talking quite tough. How much of this is performance for domestic audiences?
Some of it is inevitably, no doubt, negotiation theatrics. Of course, for us as outside observers, we don't actually know how much of it is that and how much of it is real problems because we're not in the room. I think it is fair to say that the mood is pretty downbeat on both sides. It is equally fair to say that this was always going to go down to the wire, the 11th hour, 1 minute to midnight, describe it how you like. It is now 1 minute to midnight, though. So this is the final throw of the dice, as one source in the British government put it to me in the last couple of hours. But it was also pointed out to me that it is often darkest just before dawn. Both sides want a deal if they can get one, and that's why they are still talking. So a deal is still possible, but on the British side, there's also an acknowledgement that a no-deal scenario could also happen now.
So apart from fish, what are the key stumbling blocks still?
One is competition rules, what is sometimes not particularly helpfully called a level playing field. In other words, the rules that both economies, the UK and the EU, are governed by. That the EU wants to see the UK sign up to things like environmental and employment and agricultural standards. Absolutely central to the UK's argument is, look, Brexit is all about sovereignty and control. We will have our own high standards, but we will set them, is the mantra that comes from the UK. There is definitely a frustration on the British side that, in their view, the EU is failing to acknowledge that sovereignty and control was a driving motivation behind Brexit and is therefore a non-negotiable as far as London is concerned. The bottom line is, after all of the noise and the negotiation of the last 4.5 years since the UK voted to leave the European Union, this is now the end game.
That was Chris Mason. Well, the failure to reach an agreement since March has prompted claims that both sides are involved in bluff and brinkmanship. So what are the chances of a deal at this late stage? Our Europe correspondent Nick Beake assesses the mood at the EU.
One diplomat in Brussels told me he views today's developments as part of the necessary choreography before a deal is reached and then championed by both sides. But there's a prevailing pessimism that the outcome, which both sides claim they still desire, will slip away. The concern is that this is not just haggling over the price of fish, however symbolic that sector may be, but trying to find agreement on competition rules which underpin the whole single market. The EU continues to demand that Boris Johnson agrees to sufficiently high employment, environmental and agricultural standards and a robust system of governance. The UK continues to implore Brussels to finally, at some point, acknowledge the UK's newfound independence. Whether or not both objectives can be achieved in a fashion that can be sold to respective domestic audiences may become clearer very soon.
That was Nick Beake in Brussels. This is the BBC World Service in London. Still to come on the newsroom.
I'm filling up my samovar, my rather ornate Russian tea urn.
And you can find out why a little later. First, Fiona has the headlines.
Donald Trump has made his first public speech since losing the US presidential election, rallying a crowd in Georgia to vote for 2 Republican senators facing crucial runoff elections. As we heard a moment ago, last-ditch talks will resume on Sunday to try to break the Brexit deadlock. And the Russian-led consortium building the contentious Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline says work on it is restarting after a year's suspension.
Yes, and that's despite continued opposition from the United States and several European countries. Terry Egan has been following the story and he's here now. So tell us a bit more about this, Terry.
Well, this pipeline has long been controversial, Jackie. Nord Stream 1 was finished in 2011. This is almost finished, and most of it has already been laid. Nearly $10 billion have been invested in it one way or another, and it'll double Russia's natural gas shipments to Germany under the Baltic Sea, giving it affordable energy, especially as it phases out nuclear and coal. And crucially for Russia, it'll avoid Ukraine. But critics argue that it makes Germany and Europe too reliant on energy from what's seen as a politically unreliable partner. The United States is against it, and so are several European countries. Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states are fiercely opposed. They fear Russia will use its leverage to exert political pressure. More importantly, Washington thinks the project will compromise European energy security. Even on Saturday, the acting US ambassador to Germany, Robin Quinville, called for the work to be stopped. US sanctions targeted the companies involved, mainly the Russian giant Gazprom, so work was suspended a year ago.
But now it's resuming.
Yes, its supporters say that pulling the plug on this would damage Europe's reputation as a stable place for investment and would push up prices for consumers. It would also leave Germany the problem of where to get its energy from. Money rules, and German shipping authorities have now advised vessels to avoid the Baltic Sea area for most of December, where it's being constructed. Ironically, one reason many Germans supported it is because its biggest critic was Donald Trump. He said Germany was captive to it, but he's fiercely disliked by many Germans. A lot of them thought he was so against it just in order to sell American fuel to Germany instead. So his criticism of it has only served to boost its popularity.
Terry, thank you. That was Terry Egan. After a 2-year investigation, police in Italy say they've broken up an international people smuggling ring. They've arrested 19 people for allegedly helping migrants enter Europe. Anna Aslam reports.
The police say those arrested include Italians, Iraqi Kurds and Afghans. The alleged smugglers are accused of paying criminal groups in Turkey and Greece to send migrants to Italy using hired or stolen sailboats. After their arrival, the migrants were given temporary accommodation and fake documents, including proof of residence and work contracts. They were given the choice of staying in Italy or traveling onward to Northern Europe, the preferred destination for many seeking refuge and economic stability. For all of this, the migrants, who were from countries including Afghanistan, Iraq and Pakistan, are said to have paid more than $7,000. It's understood the cost of the journey was often paid by relatives via money transfer or at collection points in Turkey. The investigation into the smuggling ring began in 2018, when 10 boats carrying migrants arrived in Sicily, but Italian authorities noticed they'd come from Turkey and Greece rather than the regular crossing point in Libya.
That was Anna Aslam reporting. Let's get some sports news now with Andy Barwer.
Jackie, we have new leaders of the Football English Premier League table. Chelsea are the new pace setters after a 3-1 victory over Leeds United at Stamford Bridge in front of 2,000 fans. The Chelsea boss, Frank Lampard.
I was nervous of Leeds because they're a good team and they will be a threat to the end if you don't get that cushion when you're playing well. We had a lot of clear-cut chances, which makes you worry. Another day we could probably score 5 or 6 or whatever and finish the game. But we are still, and everyone may get excited at times, but we are still developing. We have to say that we will get better, hopefully, and being clinical will be one of those.
Manchester United made it 9 successive away league victories, a 3-1 success at West Ham. Saw Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's team go top 4, goals from Paul Pogba, Mason Greenwood and Marcus Rashford. Manchester City beat Fulham 2-0, Burnley and Everton drew 1 apiece. England's Football Association say they support all players and staff that wish to take a stand against discrimination in a respectful manner. Millwall fans booed players who took the knee before the second-tier championship game at home to Derby County. The former Premier League striker and now TV and radio pundit Dion Dublin has very clear views on what happened.
What does that say to me? It says that people that don't like other people back in the Black Lives Matter have a problem with black people. To me, it says they're racist. And I don't think it's right. Millwall don't think it's right. But the minority have spoilt it.
Atletico Madrid are the new pace-setters in Spain's La Liga, 2-0 winners at home to Real Valladolid. Real Madrid needed an own goal to win 1-0 at Sevilla to go third in the table, their first league win in 4 matches. Barcelona are now 12 points off the top. They suffered a 4th league defeat of the campaign. They were beaten 2-1 away at Cadiz. It'll be an all-Mercedes front row of the grid for today's Sakir Formula One Grand Prix. Valtteri Bottas will be on pole position alongside Lewis Hamilton's replacement for the race, Britain's George Russell. And an emphatic win for New Zealand's cricketers. They defeated West Indies by an innings and 134 runs in the first test in Hamilton.
Andy, thank you. That was Andy Barwell. For Vladimir Putin, it's not just the coronavirus pandemic that's making 2020 a difficult year. In recent months, the Kremlin has been facing a whole series of geopolitical challenges on its doorstep, including mass protests in Belarus and the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg looks now at whether these dramatic events suggest that Russia is losing influence in its own backyard.
I'm filling up my samovar, my rather ornate Russian tea urn, to boil some water. Now, I know it's an odd way to begin a report on geopolitics, but whenever I think of Russia and the countries around it, I think of the samovar. I remember an old Soviet poster that showed a gold samovar with the Soviet flag and around it 15 teacups for the 15 Soviet republics and the slogan, "One big happy family." Modern Russia still tries to be the samovar. It views much of the geopolitical crockery around it as its tea set, its zone of influence. But today, there is no happy family, only the sound of cups and saucers smashing. For example, in Belarus this year, there have been mass protests against a dictator who's been propped up by Moscow. There's been revolution in Kyrgyzstan, political change in Moldova, and a war. Azerbaijan teaming up with Turkey to defeat Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. All of this has left the Kremlin with a giant geopolitical headache.
2020 is indeed a year of a series of geopolitical disasters for Vladimir Putin.
Political commentator Konstantin von Eggert believes that what we're seeing now are the limits of President Putin's influence in his own backyard.
He was unable to defend militarily his main ally in South Caucasus. He was unable to stop a peaceful democratic revolution and essentially societal change in Belarus, which is in union with Russia. And he was completely unable to prevent a pro-European candidate from gaining a democratically legitimate election in Moldova. All this shows that the Kremlin is not able to impact the political processes in the post-Soviet space.
That doesn't mean the Russian samovar has given away all its teacups. Russian soldiers are on parade in Moldova, or rather a part of Moldova that's broken away and declared itself independent, Transnistria. The Russian troops are officially peacekeepers, but they give the Kremlin political leverage should Moldova try to pivot to the West. The country's new president, Maya Sandu, told me that's exactly what she's planning.
Our objective is hopefully one day to become a member of the European Union.
But would Russia let that happen? Would Russia let your country join the EU?
It's our choice. In the end, we'll have to do what's right for us.
Russia has, 1,500 troops in your country?
True, but we have been demanding and will continue to demand the withdrawal of the troops.
But is it unlikely that Russia would give up influence here?
Unfortunately, Russia hasn't implemented international agreements on withdrawing the Russian troops, but we will continue to demand that.
Ultimately, though, Russia's room for influencing the old Soviet space may be limited by new realities, new regional players, from China to Turkey, America and the EU. and, as Konstantin von Eggert suggests, by Moscow's current status as an ex-empire.
A significant part of Russian society is still wedded to the idea of having a sort of empire, but it will have to say goodbye to it quite soon, historically speaking. Russia itself is undergoing a transition from an empire to a nation state, although it will take probably decades, and this is an inevitable process.
And a painful one for a country so used to seeing itself as the samovar and a superpower.
Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. Now, Fiona has some of the other stories we're watching today.
One of the key figures behind the August coup in Mali has been chosen for a top post. Colonel Malik Dior was unanimously elected to lead the National Transitional Council, despite concern over the military's continued influence in the country. A sheriff's department in the US state of Alabama has come under fire over a Facebook photo showing a Christmas tree adorned with mugshots of suspects. It called the decorations thug shots in a Facebook post that drew thousands of negative comments. Local civil liberties groups have described the post as despicable. Violent confrontations in Paris between riot police and demonstrators have taken place for a second consecutive weekend. Protesters opposed to a draft law protecting French police from being filmed on duty attacked shops and torched cars. Riot police used tear gas against them. And the Saudi foreign minister has added his voice to a chorus of optimism that a resolution of the long-running dispute pitting several Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, against Qatar may be in sight. Prince Faisal bin Farhan said current prospects were very positive.
Scientists have recovered the first significant quantities of rock samples from an asteroid in space. As Mark Lobel reports, there was a tense moment as Japanese scientists watched their space capsule return to Earth after a 6-year voyage.
There was joy and relief as the soil samples sent from the Japanese spacecraft Hayabusa 2, part of a 6-year mission, parachuted down safely in the Australian desert. Scientists are expecting about 0.1 of a gram will be returned for examination at their lab near Tokyo from the asteroid Ryugu, which lies some 300 million kilometers away. They will measure the rock's age, what it's made of, and how it's formed, potentially offering vital clues to how the sun and planets came to be, as Sarah Russell, leader of the Planetary Materials Group from London's Natural History Museum, explains.
This one is special because this one is going to an asteroid that we think is really rich in organic material and in water. So in the very earliest history of the Earth, we think it might have been pelted with asteroids like that. And that's what gave us the water and the carbon to form our oceans and to enable life to flourish on Earth.
It's an exciting prospect for many Japanese space fans after a successful landing following what one member of the space agency described as a perfect mission, with many more to come, which this young space fan is looking forward to.
I had jotted down the dates when the probe adjusted its orbit. If there's a Hayabusa 3 or 4 or even 5, I'd like to be involved in the mission.
That next mission comes now for the mothership, having launched its first capsule, to boldly go examining near-Earth asteroids where no one has gone before.
That was Mark Lobel reporting, and there's more on that story on the science pages of our website. Stay with us if you can. We'll have a news summary for you in just a moment. I'm Jackie Leonard. You've been listening to The Newsroom.
This is the BBC World Service, where Harriet Gilbert is here to tell us about the final author from the BBC World Book Club's year devoted to women writers.
I think I started this book because I didn't know my family history very well.
On this month's World Book Club, I chat with Yaa Gyasi about her novel, Homegoing.
I was getting myself into something that would really take over my life.
Opening in the 18th century in West Africa, Homegoing begins with two half-sisters who don't know each other. One is sold into slavery. The other becomes a slave trader's wife.
I started to realize that I really wanted people to feel that passage of time. I wanted time itself to feel as though it were a character.
Over the next 200 plus years, we follow the stories of the sisters and their descendants from Africa to America, with each generation bearing the different scars of slavery.
World Book Club. In half an hour.
The death of George Floyd sent shockwaves around the world this year.
As we witness the death of another unarmed black man at the hands of police in America.
Why does it keep happening?
And why does it seem so hard to call bad cops to account?
I'm Katty Kay of the BBC World Service.
And I'm Carlos Watson of Aussie Media.
Join us as we explore the future of policing in America.
That's next on When Katty Met Carlos, after the news.
BBC News with Fiona McDonald.